All right, James, the segment we love, questions from those really, really smart listeners out there. A number today are about politics. And let me tell you, listeners out there, I've been doing this for a long time because I'm really old. And the two smartest people, whatever we call them, consultants, operative strategists, I have ever known are James Carville and Stu Spencer. They may not know what kind of buy you want to make in Des Moines or who's the county chair down in Harris County, but they know politics, and there's no one better to ask right now than James Carville. So, James, let's start with Christian in Mississippi, who says, this is just a matter of personal curiosity from someone who's never been involved in politics. How do you approach concretely as a consultant? You're assigned a county you've never been to in Idaho or someplace and told to cut the Republican margins. What are some of the first things you do? What are the data points you collect? How do you collect them, and how do you formulate a strategy?
Right, and a lot of that depends on your resources. But what you generally try to do in politics is take all of the people that you know are going to vote against you no matter what, all right? Add that to all of the people that you know are going to vote for you no matter what. And then take those two numbers, add them together, and then subtract that from 100. So let's say if Idaho's probably, but maybe the parts of Idaho, boys, that are pretty Democratic. So you say based on voting behavior, I think that 31% of these are going to vote against us no matter what. They're chronic voters. They turn out in high rates. They always vote Republicans. There's 24% in here that are chronic voters that Democratic. They all vote Democratic. All right. So you take those two numbers. You probably say, well, 31 and 24. All right. Then you say, all right, now who are the rest of these voters? What are the traits? You know, do they tend to be older? Do they tend to be less white? Do they go to church? Do they own guns? Do they have anything? And then once you figure that out, you say to yourself, or equally important, who are people that don't normally vote, that if we got them out, they would vote for our side? So that's basically when you start doing a campaign, it's the stuff you do in the third grade. It's, by this plus that equal that minus this is your target. And I think that found that little back of the envelope formula to be the rudimentary beginning of every campaign that you get into. And people always want to talk to the 24% that are already for you because you get good emotional feedback, you get good, the fun, you get a standing ovation, but doesn't do you much good.
Christian, I hope you've written all that down because you're not going to get any better advice. James, I'm going to take two.
So so this is one of my great stories in politics. We had the Clinton reunion in, I don't know, the 20th reunion, I guess it was, at the start in Little Rock. And Kaya Anderson worked with me that said that President Clinton was going through the line. And she said, Mr. President, this is my daughter. She wants to be president one day. What advice do you have for her? And he kind of put his head back in a way, he kind of shook his finger, and he said two things: study hard and meet as many people as you can that are not like you. I think that's the best advice for a young person that wants to get into politics, is study hard and try to associate and learn about as many different people as you can that are not from the same cut of cloth that you are. I think that's
James, that's a great advice for politics. It's a great advice for other things too. It's one of my constant refrains up at the University of Pennsylvania. Spend time with people who are different than you. Football players spend time with poets. It doesn't happen enough, but that is great advice. The next, question, I'm going to combine two we have here because Hunter in Clovis, California, asked if the Democrats have any prospects for getting rid of the filibuster. And Nick from down in Melbourne, Australia, wants to know what strategies can Democrats adopt to pass the John Lewis voting rights, given the likely filibuster by Republicans and the awful stuff that already Republicans are trying to do in states to curb voting. Our friend Fred Wertheimer has, I think, an interesting idea here. I'm not sure it'll fly because you're not going to get that kind of campaign reform stuff through the Senate with Mitch McConnell there. The only thing that Mitch McConnell cares more about than judges is his power and his money, and this would threaten that. He will do whatever it takes to stop it. So you got to break the filibuster. And what Fred and others are talking about is there ought to be some kind of modification so that on a small number of bills, and this would be the perfect vehicle. This is about citizens' rights. This is about their right to vote. This is about getting rid of some of the sleaze in the business. I don't know if they can do it, but that's the way to do it.
I agree. I defer to Fred and you on this because you've been much more schooled in the ways of Hill. Just don't say you're repealing the filibuster. You're just modifying it on this one kind of national emergency thing. And eventually, depending on what happens, they'll probably chip away at it. But yeah, I think that's if it comes about, it'll come about. I suspect in some way like that.
Right.
But
James, Dave in Seattle, this is going to you again. The eminence Greece, as they say. He says, I'm wondering, where do I contribute dollars now? The 2020 election is over. I'm still getting multiple frantic calls. Look what Mitch did now. You know those emails that go out and text. I want to live my life, but I want to keep donating because I really care about what's happening in the country. Do I donate to the DNC, the Senate committee, the House committee? I can't do them all. So how do I decide? What do you recommend?
I would go directly to the Senate campaigns. And I would, of course, pay particular attention, as I think you would agree, to North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. You got a tough hole in Georgia. I mean, really tough hole in Georgia. You got a pretty tough hole in Arizona. So pick out the Senate seats that you think that the Democrats have a good chance. And I would, unless you're going to write, huge $100,000 checks, or you're in some danger of busting a limit, which I'm assuming you're not, I would always advise people to have more leeway. There's certain amounts of money that's restricted and they can't get the best rate or anything. Pound for pound, dollar for dollar, I recommend a direct contribution to the campaign.
Hey, thanks for listening to Politics War Room with James Carville, and I'm Al Hunt. Don't forget to send your questions for us by email to politicswarroom@gmail.com or tweet them for next week's show at Politicon. We love the questions. Remember to include where you're from. Also, remember to check out the links to our sponsors in the show notes. We deeply thank you for supporting them. It's what makes this podcast happen. To keep up with us every week, subscribe to Politics War Room on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. Please rate the show with a 5-star review. We'll be back next week with another show as we continue our war room planning. Next week, the impeachment trial will be underway.